All right, let's talk about business growth. On the surface, it seems pretty straightforward, right? Just get bigger. But when you peel back the layers, you find it's this really complex balancing act between risk, efficiency, and sheer scale.
There's this old saying, bigger is always better. But is it really? That's the big question we're tackling. Because as we're about to see, choosing to expand isn't just a goal. It's a huge strategic decision, packed with some amazing upsides, but also some really nasty pitfalls.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll get into the actual physics of scale, the forces that push and pull on a company's size. Then, we'll hit that big strategic crossroads, to grow or not grow. And finally, we'll look at the different ways companies actually do it, from growing on their own to buying up the competition.
Okay, to really wrap our heads around this, we've got to start with the absolute fundamentals. Think of it like this. Every single business, no matter the industry, is caught between two powerful opposing forces. And these forces are what ultimately determine how big a company can or even should get. It's basically a constant tug of war. Pulling in one direction, you've got economies of scale. That's the good stuff, where getting bigger makes you more efficient. But pulling just as hard in the other direction are diseconomies of scale. And that's when a company's size starts to become its own worst enemy.
So let's unpack economies of scale a bit. How does it actually work? Well, here's the key thing to remember. It's not that your total costs go down. In fact, they almost always go up as you produce more. The magic is in spreading out your big, chunky fixed costs, think a multi-million-dollar factory or a massive advertising blitz, over thousands or even millions of products. The more you make, the less each individual unit has to pay for that big initial expense.
And you see these savings pop up literally everywhere in a growing business. Financially, big companies are a safer bet, so banks give them cheaper loans. Management, they can afford to hire a super specialist for everything. Marketing becomes way more efficient, they get massive discounts buying in bulk, they can even spread their risk across different products. Every single one of these things helps chip away at the cost of making just one item.
But here's where it gets really fascinating. Sometimes, these cost savings have nothing to do with the company itself. Instead, they come from the outside, from the entire industry setting up shop in the same geographic area.
This example from the UK is perfect. You've got all these car manufacturers clustering in Sunderland. What happens? Well, thousands of their suppliers move in right next door, which absolutely slashes transportation costs. Not only that, but it creates this amazing local pool of skilled workers, and the government starts investing in better roads and infrastructure. Suddenly, everybody in that cluster benefits, not just one company.
Of course, there's always a flip side, right? If you grow too much, you can overshoot that perfect sweet spot of efficiency. And that's when the company starts to trip over its own feet. This is what we call diseconomies of scale. The point where making more stuff actually starts to make each item more expensive, because the sheer complexity of being huge starts to cause major problems.
And the reasons for this are, well, they're very human. Communication just grinds to a halt when a message has to go through 10 layers of management. Different departments start building their own little empires, sometimes working against each other. And just think about the logistical nightmare of managing teams across different time zones and cultures. All that friction and all those misunderstandings, they start adding real costs to the bottom line.
Okay, so now that we understand these two opposing forces, we get to the real art of the matter. We're at a strategic crossroads, the same one every leadership team eventually faces. Do we keep our foot on the gas and keep growing? Or is this the right time to stop?
And believe me, the temptation to grow is incredibly powerful. I mean, we're talking about gaining real market power. We get to set the prices instead of just accepting them. It's about hitting those peak economies of scale to keep competitors at bay, boosting your profits, and spreading your risk. Oh, and yeah, when you're big, getting money for your next big idea is a whole lot easier.
But hold on, if growing is so great, why aren't all businesses huge? Well, check out this number. It's pretty staggering. In 2021, about 99% of all businesses in the European Union were classified as small. Now, that's not a story of failure. It's proof that staying small is an incredibly common and totally valid business strategy.
And it really comes down to a clear set of trade-offs. On the one hand, small companies can absolutely own a niche market. They can offer super personalized service and pivot on a dime when things change. But on the other hand, they're vulnerable. They don't have that big financial cushion for when the economy goes south, getting loans can be tough, and attracting the best talent is a constant battle. And let's not forget the huge personal toll it can take on the owner.
And that brings us to a really crucial point. Running a business isn't always about squeezing every last drop of profit out of it.
For a lot of owners, the goal is something called satisficing. Achieving a good enough income, a stable quality of life. For them, control and less stress are way more valuable than the constant pressure cooker of expansion.
Right. So let's say a business does decide to grow. Now they have to figure out how. The first path they can take is what we call internal or organic growth. This is the slow and steady approach where you expand piece by piece using the money you're already making. Now, this is usually the safest way to do it. You control the pace, it's way less risky because you're funding it with your own profits instead of taking on tons of debt, and you get to keep your company culture intact. The big catch? It can be agonizingly slow. While you're growing brick by brick, a competitor might just swoop in and grab the market, and you might never get big enough to really tap into those maximum economies of scale.
So, if organic growth is the scenic route, then external growth through mergers and acquisitions or M&A is the express lane. This is the fast track where companies either join forces or just straight up buy each other.
And there's a difference here. A merger is when two companies mutually agree to become one. Think about what happened with the Indian video platforms Moj and MX Takatak. Boom, overnight they created a giant with 300 million users. An acquisition, on the other hand, is a takeover. One company buys a controlling stake in another, and sometimes, like when Kraft bought Cadbury, it's a hostile move, where they go right over the heads of the company's own board.
M&A basically comes in three main flavors. You've got vertical integration, where you buy one of your suppliers or customers. The big risk there, you might not have a clue how to actually run that new type of business. Then there's horizontal. That's when you merge with a direct competitor. Awesome for market power, but you're just asking for a massive culture clash. And finally, you have a conglomerate merger, buying a totally unrelated business. The idea is to spread risk, but man, it is so hard to manage wildly different companies all under one roof.
All right, last category. Sometimes the smartest way to grow isn't to buy another company, but to partner up with one. These are the collaborative methods, where businesses decide to, share the journey. There are a few different ways to do this. A joint venture is pretty formal. Two companies get together and create an entirely new, separate company to achieve a specific goal. The EE Mobile network is a great example of this. A strategic alliance is a bit more casual. It's more of a partnership on a project, without all the hassle of creating a whole new company. And then, of course, there's franchising, probably the one you're most familiar with. Think McDonald's, where they sell the rights for someone else to use their famous brand and proven business model. Franchising, though, has this really interesting trade-off at its core. For the main company, the franchisor, it's amazing. You get to expand super fast using other people's money to build your stores. But the risk? Oh, it's huge. You lose direct, day-to-day control over quality, and that means just one badly run franchise can tarnish the reputation of the entire global brand, practically overnight.
And that leads us to one final question to chew on. We've talked about how one of the biggest dangers of getting too big is those diseconomies, especially when managers get territorial and departments stop cooperating. So thinking back to those three types of M&A, horizontal, vertical, and conglomerate, which one do you think poses the biggest risk of that kind of internal warfare breaking out? Give it some thought. The answer tells you a lot about the hidden dangers lurking inside the push to get bigger.